Video introduces an app for calculating transient heat budgets of ectotherms. And what I mean by transient is that we're accounting for the effect of the thermal inertia of the organism due to its mass. So normally, the other apps, the niche mapper apps, are using a steady state calculation. So that's like pressing pause on the environmental conditions and allowing the organism to come to a steady state temperature with that environment. But if the environments are changing very quickly relative to the speed with which the organism is changing, then we have a transient situation. And so something like a crocodile or a dinosaur is generally changing much more slowly than the environmental changes. For many purposes, a steady state is fine, but certain questions, particularly for large organisms, or also when we're thinking about an animal moving from shade into sun and wanting to know how quickly it would change in temperature. For these questions, we need a transient heat budget. So that's what these apps are employing. And the details about this particular app in this paper called Modeling the Joint Effects of Body Size and Microclimate on the Heat Budgets and Foraging Opportunities of Ectotherms, which I wrote with Warren Porter and Ray Huey. And this paper is considering two different aspects that we need to think about when we're predicting how size affects the temperatures of organisms in nature. There's the size effect that's due to that causes the thermal inertia that I've already mentioned. And there are also interesting boundary layer effects of size, like a larger organism has a thicker boundary layer, and so it's more coupled it's less coupled to air temperature, but it's still coupled to radiation, and so it becomes more affected by the radiation environment than the air temperature. Whereas a small organism with a very tiny boundary layer is very strongly coupled to the air temperature and a bit less so to the radiation environment. So that this little diagram here is showing that by the shading here indicating the boundary layer. And if they were at the same height above the ground, then actually the large organism would get hotter ultimately because of this boundary layer effect. But that's one aspect of size. The other thing we need to consider is the fact that small organisms are closer to the ground, and that creates a very different microclimatic experience for them because there's a boundary layer of air on the ground, and that causes the air to be quite still. As you get closer to the ground, the wind speed goes down, but also that during the day, the air temperature is going up as you get closer to the ground. And so here we have the animals at the same height, suspended above the ground by a chain in this little diagram. But in this diagram on the right, we have a more realistic natural situation where the small animal is closer to the ground. You can see the wind speed is lower as indicated by the arrows, the air temperature higher as indicated by the shading. So it's in a higher temperature environment, a lower wind speed, even though it's less coupled to radiation, it's actually potentially going to get hotter. So that's what this app is accounting for. It allows you to account for both of these effects and make calculations of the temperatures of animals in natural environments according to their size. So here's the app, and it will have somewhat similar feel to it to the other apps that I've introduced in previous videos. You've got the Show Ectotherm Model Parameters tab, but maybe I'll show you the Show Microclimate Model Parameters tab first. This is exactly the same as the Global Monthly Climatology Soil Microclimate Model that I introduced first. So it's got all the same parameters. It's running that microclimate model. So you can run a microclimate and you can see the plots, of course, as in the other app. But it's a little bit different in terms of what parameters we have for the ectotherm and what it's plotting. So maybe we'll just go through the plot first. What we have is a plot of the body temperature in gold of the thermoregulating animal in a transient state. So what you see is it starts off pretty stable, and then it rises in temperature, and then it starts shuttling. It starts cooling and then warming, then cooling, then warming. So this is the animal going in and out of the shade. What you can see in gray is the steady state temperature. This is what we calculate if the body temperature would be if the animal just stayed out in the open and didn't thermoregulate. So you can see it's getting up to over 50 degrees, way above the critical thermal maximum that's been specified here for the animal. So this shuttling behavior is keeping it from overheating, but you can see how long it takes to cool down and then how quickly it warms up. And this is driven by its mass. And so what we have, if we look at the ectotherm parameters, we've got an ectotherm that's 1 kilogram. And what you can also see on this plot is the air temperature. So this is the air temperature in the shade. And you can see the animal, as it cools, is heading for that air temperature. And how far away it is from that air temperature dictates how quickly it cools down. So it's going to cool down more quickly if it's further away from that air temperature. It's exponentially declining in how much the temperature is changing through time. And then we have this plot here of the foraging radii. And this is for a particular foraging bout. So you can see that there's a series of foraging bouts. Actually, if I talk you through this a little bit more, what we have is initially the animal's inactive and sitting in the shade, and then it goes out into the sun to start warming up, and it's positioning itself perpendicular to the sun's rays and warming quite quickly. And once it gets to the foraging temperature, it starts to change its angle to somewhere in between perpendicular and parallel to the sun's rays. And it keeps trying to do that until it can be warm enough for foraging in that posture. So it's sort of still waiting for it to get warm enough to actually forage in a non-perpendicular to the sun's rays posture. And then it can have its first foraging bout. So this is the first foraging bout, and it goes up to its maximum foraging temperature and then has to go into the shade to cool down. And then this is foraging bout number 2. And it doesn't get to forage for very long because it's heating up very quickly now. And what you can see in this plot is the radii of the distance they could have moved in that foraging bout. So at 9:55 in the morning, foraging bout number 2, they could have moved 49 meters in that time with this particular movement speed, which you can set. This is their movement speed in kilometers per hour. And this plot on the right shows the location that's been chosen, and it's at the same scale. You can see 100 meters here, 100 meters here. So you can see the configuration of the bushes. And of course, this animal has to be able to, if it goes out into the open, it has to be able to get, if it's going to move beyond the bush that it's currently under, it's going to have to move, it's going to have to get to that bush before it gets too hot. So the bush spacing has to be close enough for them to be able to wander through the habitat. And you can see there is connection. This is just randomly arrayed bushes. And you can see that the animal could have potentially moved around a little bit in the habitat, but there are situations where it may not have been able to in this random assortment of bushes, and also potentially in this scene here. This is foraging bout number 2, but if we choose foraging bout number 1, you can see that the foraging radii are very large because it has quite a long time to move before it heats up to the maximum foraging temperature. So you can play around with how the configuration of shade in that environment, the spacing between the shade, would allow the organism to move through that habitat. I'll go back to 2, foraging bout number 2. Now I'm going to change the size of the animal. I'm going to take it down to the size of a 10-gram animal, like a little dragon. This is what we had before was like a goanna. This is actually a scene in Australia. This is in Australia. It's where we're running the simulation. I should have mentioned that. So we're in the arid part of Australia. And a 1 kilogram lizard is having quite limited distances they can move with each foraging bout in the middle of the day, but quite a long one early in the morning and a long one in the afternoon. If we make it a 10-gram animal, see what happens. Now, it takes a little while to make this calculation because this is doing an integration through time, where it's integrating through time and then checking to see whether it's reached a threshold, then coming out of the integration, changing what the behavior is. So is it trying to cool? Is it trying to warm? And then going back into the integrator. So it's quite computationally intensive, but it doesn't take too long. And what we end up with is much tighter foraging shorter foraging bouts because of the small size of the animal. So the foraging radii have gone from 50 meters down to 18 meters at this second foraging bout, this one here. But if we go to foraging bout number 1, you'll see that, again, the landscape's quite connected. If in the morning and the afternoon. So that just shows you how important movement for these animals is early in the morning. So that's with the animal hovering 7.5 centimeters above the ground at the height of the large lizard, but actually that's not really what happens. These small lizards are probably more like a centimeter or less above the ground. So if we run the model with a more realistic height above the ground, we had 45 foraging bouts before. We've got the total activity in the open in minutes and hours. They had less activity when close to the ground. That's because they're in a warmer environment with stiller air, and so it makes it even harder. The foraging radius hasn't changed too much, but yeah, this is a way to play around with those questions about how does the size of the animal affect its foraging opportunities, accounting for the transient heat balance, as well as the height above the ground. And you can change the shape of the animal. You can, as previously with the ectotherm model, and you can also change the minimum and maximum foraging temperature, the temperature at which they'll emerge from the shade, their solar absorptivity, critical maximum temperature, and thermal properties of the animal, as well as you can add metabolic heat production if you want as well. So read more about it in the paper Methods in Ecology and Evolution if you're interested in this. And also there's lots of help on the 1 lump and 1 lump var and 2 lump functions. You can see what the difference is between those different functions in both the help and in the paper. And there's a very detailed derivation of the equations that are used for this, thanks to Warren Porter. All right, that's the Transient Heat Budget app.